You've entered Bookstorm with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Welcome back to Bookstorm Podcast, all you fiction lovers. You know, we at Bookstorm are super happy when we get an author who comes back to see us a second time, even if they're incognito, like this one is, because we had Michael Koryta, but now we have Scott Carson. We're thrilled to have him. We're here to talk about a book that Kristen and I really loved. We treasured every ounce of it. And Scott, welcome to Bookstorm Podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me back under any name.
We're going to call you Scott for the duration of this podcast so that all of our listeners keep thinking about Lost Man's Lane, written by Scott Carson. Fantastic. But before we get started, let me tell our listeners a little bit about you. You know him as Michael Koryta. He is a New York Times best-selling author whose work has been translated into 20 languages. It's been lauded by Stephen King, Michael Connelly, Lee Child, Lisa Unger, Dean Koontz, James Patterson, and more. He's gotten so many accolades and awards, but I want to mention a few. His book has been selected as Best Book of the Year by some pretty amazing publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Amazon, Oprah, Entertainment Weekly, People, Reader's Digest, Bookstorm Podcast, got to throw that in there, and more, and well-deserved. We're just super excited to talk about this book with you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Well, Scott, before we get started, I like to give our listeners just a little bit of the backdrop of what's going on in the story. And at the end, if you want to add anything, we would, of course, love that. Now, in your story, and you're talking about Lost Man's Lane, we meet 16-year-old Marshall Miller. He is a high schooler in Bloomington, Indiana, and everyone is talking about a shocking crime where a young woman has vanished. Now, Miller's observations about this matter have earned him a lot of attention, as well as a summer internship working for the private investigator who is researching and doing some investigation on her case. Now, Marshall is enjoying this job, but as he investigates with his mentor, he's beginning to see a lot of darkness that begins to emerge in this case and in the town itself. In fact, the case is even complicated by the fact that the last time anyone saw this young woman, she was in the back of a police car by somebody who was impersonating a police officer in a uniform from long ago. Now, after another incident, the entire town and beyond begins to accuse Marshall of lying. And even his best friend is acting differently towards him. His detective mentor withdraws, and Marshall begins to be very concerned. He knows what he saw, and he believes what he saw, but he realizes that the darkness in this town is pretty wide-ranging, and it needs to be explained. But it might be far bigger than he can handle. Is there anything you want to add to that background? And I know it's hard to not give away spoilers.
No, I wanted to take you on tour with me so you can answer the question, what is the book about? That's
awesome.
That was a really lovely overview. Thank you.
Everybody tells Kristen that. And I've said this a million times on the podcast. I'm like, Kristen can come. Can I come? And I'll just carry your briefcase.
We welcome you.
So yes, we're big fans. I wanted to say to our listeners, we're super grateful for all of you. We're up to 80 countries, all 50 US states, 1,700 cities. We love this book, Kristen and I. And I want to talk to Scott a little bit deeper about it. Let's talk about believing in things you can't prove or see. Noah said, there are forces in this town, in this world, that I spent my life trying to understand. Some of these forces are right here. He taps a limestone chimney. Some are out there. He spreads a hand towards the town. Then he adds, that is the reason why the word supernatural includes the word natural. There are inexplicable occurrences, but people don't want to believe they exist. We look for facts and only facts. As the author, why are we so intrigued by the unseen world? Why are we fearful or not fearful? And I can't help but ask, what do you believe?
I love that you highlighted that passage because it's essentially like you're putting your finger on the reason I write in general. But particularly the reason I write books like this under the Scott Carson name, where the supernatural is always going to be an element of the story. I would say I'm fascinated by the idea of mystery, and it's the concept that for everything we know about the world, we have unknowns. And I think the way we seek to balance our lack of total understanding and certainly our lack of control over the world is so often through storytelling. And so that natural supernatural element that you quoted, I think about that sort of thing a lot, and it fascinates me. We have a great example of this coming up on April 8th when the solar eclipse comes along. And ironically, I just learned this, the epicenter of the eclipse and the path of totality, I think they call it, will pass directly over my house and over the real Lost Man's Lane. So I thought that was very nice. We should have scheduled a book release for the eclipse. But I'm thinking about something like that, people are all excited because we understand what it is and we can predict it. But if you imagine an era, not that long ago when you lacked that knowledge, and you consider the day literally turning to night and then back to day, if you lack the explanation, just imagine how terrifying that would be. And I know almost every culture, I think, has eclipse folklore, and almost all of those stories are scary. They're either, I think, warnings or punishments for the most part. And that's a great example of what draws me to this type of storytelling. I think maybe we don't spend enough time considering all the things we don't know or that we have forgotten. And that's also a big element of the book, the backstory of there's a history to the town and to the culture that has been dismissed and forgotten. And I wanted that to be paired with this coming of age story in the way, Stephen King and Peter Straub and Ray Bradbury and Robert McCammon all come to mind as writers who did that coming of age, with the supernatural kind of chills really well. So that's what I was chasing with this one.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. And as readers, we can all relate to something in the unseen world. Look at the cultures thousands of years ago, all around this planet in the most remote areas, all believe in something spiritual, something unseen. They never heard of each other. And then I have this other weird theory. I may as well say it.
We also share snake mythology too, that's a component of the book. And I became, sorry to interrupt, but I became fascinated with, just to your point, the overlap of you can move anywhere in the world and you can find stories around, the snake, the eclipse, things like that unseen or very much seen, but it's that desire to tie in an emotional story with the natural world.
Mm-hmm. And you did it in this story, and I loved it. And so what is it? As long as you're talking about snakes, what is it about snakes that we fear so much? Why are we so enthralled with snakes? Does it have anything to do with the slits for eyes and the snapping forked tongue? That it maybe have something to do with it?
I think yes, they are. So I'm someone who I do have, I guess it's not a true phobia because I can be around them. I'm not going to, run out of a room if there is a snake present. I'm thinking, however, of a snake in a cage. I'd rather not just run into one, but there is something really fascinating. I've only encountered a rattlesnake in the wild once. I was on a hiking trip in Virginia and we heard it. And I was so struck by, I knew immediately what it was. There was no hesitation of, could that be a rattlesnake? And this is not a sound I've heard before, except on, TV. It's not something I was anticipating. So there is this very primal response to it. And I love that fear, along with all of the mythology and the idea of thematically playing with, you have characters who, in different ways, shed their skin. They're one thing in front of the public, and then back in their home, in the privacy of their own den, they might be a little more dangerous, or vice versa. And so I had a lot of fun symbolically playing with that with each character.
I love that too, because you think about snakes and we do view them in different ways too, from healing to condemnation. And so we saw a lot of elements in your story, metaphorically, that were so fascinating. We just loved it. We actually have been talking about your book quite a bit. So I want to ask you, when we meet Marshall Miller, it's at a very important time in his life. He's a high schooler. He's loves a girl. He just got his driver's license, and he's contending with some bullies that are a little bigger than he is, and bigger and stronger. But these important milestones in his life are very much a springboard for him having to navigate some of the very big issues in life, like loyalty and love and relationships. And I thought it was really cool because, at one point he says people tend to minimize the concerns that older teens may have. But these are very real concerns, and they set them up for how they're going to deal with these issues for the rest of their lives, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's one of the reasons I love coming of age stories, is that you're capturing this time capsule moment where things are not set in stone for you, but you certainly start down a path, and you can be, helped along that or hindered. I think one of the elements for me personally that I enjoyed writing, but it was one of the reasons I wanted to write this kind of story, was to address the importance of the mentor figure who is not your parent. So Marshall, in the book, he doesn't know who his father is, and he has a single mother. Their relationship is key to the story. I grew up, I had wonderful parents. They were very supportive, but when you reach a certain age, 16, 17, I think most of us that's when we think of ourselves as adults. And you sort of chafe at the idea that anyone in the world views you as not a fully formed adult yet. And your parents tend to be sort of in that camp, right? They're authority figures, and you're in this world in high school where, they ring a bell literally, and you have to march out of a classroom and down through the hall and into the next room, but you don't feel young. And I know in my life, I had an internship with a private detective, so that is very much drawn from my background. And then even other mentors, the people who treated me as, if not an equal, just treated me as an adult who had no skin in the game. They weren't teachers, they weren't relatives. Those people were of just huge outsized importance to me, because it allowed me to feel a little more like this thing that I thought I was, which is a fully formed human. And it's an element of the book that I had a lot of fun working with that dynamic.
Yeah, I really enjoyed seeing those mentor relationships, because there was more than one, really develop and strengthen. And it was a critical point in Marshall's life. So I loved that aspect as well. Well done.
Thank you.
And we can all relate to it. I mean, who doesn't look back and still think about something that happened in high school or middle school that we somehow survived? Oh, those were not easy years, at least for me. Maybe I'm just talking for myself.
No, absolutely. And that's one of I talked about how I had more fun writing this than I think any other book I've done. I loved intertwining the sort of mundane problems with these much bigger problems, because I think they all register on almost the same emotional Richter scale, when you're that age. The bully is as big a deal as the murderer who's in your town.
Yeah.
And you talked earlier, you said, people tend to minimize or can minimize teenage problems. And I think that's particularly true when it comes to the romantic story. As we get older, there's, you look at a 16-year-old who tells you she's in love, and there's a tendency to maybe kind of patronize or say like, oh, that's adorable, it's precious. But when you are that 16-year-old, that's the biggest thing in your life. I mean, you feel that so deeply, and it's very real. So I always appreciate writers who don't minimize or patronize to the younger protagonist.
And we especially loved the fact that Marshall was younger, and that maybe he was not yet polluted by society, and he had the courage to see things or believe in things. The one thing that really struck the reader tough that we could somehow relate to is there's nothing worse than when you're telling the truth, but nobody believes you. Marshall's friend Carrie believed Marshall's stories. Marshall thought, simple faith is the purest act of love. There is something so refreshing and empowering at any age when somebody stands beside you and defends your story. Can you expand upon that theory? Simple faith is the purest act of love. It's a great quote, and we know you wrote it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that one. I remember writing the line, and sometimes there are ideas that I have to work really hard to distill into simple language. And that was one that just came pretty easy. That's a first draft sentence. And I highlighted it the next day when I was going through and reading the pages that I'd written, because I thought, okay, here is the core of the story. We have a kid he doesn't know who his dad is, but what he knows of his father is that this man abandoned his mother and him. And then he has another character, his friend, the girl he has a crush on, Carrie, who is hanging in there with him, in his darkest hour. And I thought that point of contrast was that was the whole story. And the opposite of that, the person who doesn't hang in there, it's okay, well, that's where relationships go to die. And it's in that contrast that I thought I can really push deeper with Marshall, and hopefully the audience connects with him, because hopefully we all have at least one experience of someone staying with us and believing us when other people did not. But if you've ever had the opposite, that's kind of a unique, isolating disaster. And I wanted to give him both of those.
We loved him.
Absolutely. Your story also explored the connection between the mind and reality. And there's a point where Noah says this quote, and I want to read this. The tolls of stress on a healthy mind, the breaking point between reality and hallucination. People believed his obsession with politics and power was a poison to him. Now, these sentiments were actually relevant to several characters in your story, and sometimes even the reader wasn't sure about what was conjured up and what was reality. But I wanted to ask you, were you trying to explore some of those pressures and stresses and what they do to our perception of reality?
Absolutely. That's a great read. I like the quotes you guys pick are wonderful. You have no idea how happy that makes me, because it suggests that, the book is landing the way I wanted it to. And from a character standpoint, I've spoken a little bit about what I wanted to do with Marshall, but there's another character we haven't talked about, who is Carrie's father, Jerry Flanders. And he gave me a way into this idea of paranoid thinking. So Marshall, when he is challenged on his story and viewed as a liar, he ultimately, at least in some ways, he's going to be validated. And Jerry does not have the same outcome. He has paranoia with Y2K. And, we all we remember Y2K, but one element of the research that I really found fascinating for this book was I actually was incorrect on my memory of Y2K. I think a lot of us, or I certainly treated it, I remembered it as sort of a joke. It was like, this funny thing that just never happened. But then when you get into the weeds, you discover that if we had not spent billions of dollars and several years working to prepare for it, there really could have been some trouble. And it might not have been, the worst case apocalyptic scenario, but it would have been very serious. One of the things that I would not have known, that I found out doing the research, is the systems that New York City built to prepare for Y2K are the only reason that crucial communications stayed up on 9/11. And I thought that was very interesting. So to write this character who he believes the bad thing is going to happen, he's sure of it, and then it doesn't. I wanted to explore how that feels and try to humanize the person and remind the reader that he was being fed this wild fear, and then he suffered for believing it. So I didn't want to write the leader of a prepper group. I was interested in the follower aspect of that. I don't know if you guys read Tara Westover's book, Educated.
No,
No.
I know it was very popular.
Yeah, really interesting memoir. So that's sort of in the same time period too. But I was very interested in that idea of, when a conspiracy theory falls apart and you have really bought in, one where it's not funny to you, but you believed it. When that falls apart, what are you left with? And I was thinking of that awful story, the Pizzagate thing, where the guy from North Carolina, takes his gun to the pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., believing this narrative that he is going to find like trafficked kids there. And he does not. And all of the people who were there, they have to live with that. They have to live with that traumatic event. And he has to live with it. He goes off to prison. But the people, the snake oil salesmen who were selling him the theory that he wanted to go investigate, they don't really have to answer for it. And Jerry in 1999 particularly felt really interesting, because he sort of worked as a time capsule of a warning of a lot of poisoned thinking that we were going to begin to get. It's, the internet is in early days in 99. So he's sort of on Y2K was like a front edge conspiracy theory, I think. And now, there is nothing that happens in our world that someone doesn't have a theory about. Kansas City wins the Super Bowl, and it's because Taylor Swift is dating this guy, and it's all scripted. I mean, with the smallest, most micro things are met with these wild and outlandish theories. And you can go to whatever your chosen silo is, and you can stay there and receive this affirmation. And I thought 99 was maybe a lost innocence moment, where we started, we're post Waco and Oklahoma City, but we're about to bump into 9/11 and a lot of other, major events. So I liked that era for this story.
Yeah. I like how you mentioned about Jerry representing a time capsule, because at the same time, you also did the opposite and dealt with that generational impact of darkness and maybe distorted thinking. And so I like when a book does a couple things at once with that depth, and you certainly did that here.
I love hearing that. So a phrase that I always think of is time depth. One of the unique things about our fun human condition is we might be the only creatures on the planet that can think backward, forward, and in the present moment all at the same time. And so I'm always trying to utilize that in a story. I want the past to dictate choices a character makes. I think that's how we live our lives. And we worry about the future. We plan for it, we hope for it, but then we also have to deal with the present. And if I can achieve that kind of swirling time depth where all three things are at play at the same time, and it doesn't feel, ideally, if I'm doing my job well, then you don't think about it. It just is the way the story is unfolding.
Yeah. Absolutely. I feel like we're getting a master class in writing over here, Chris. I don't
No,
know.
we are.
I'm going to take
I'll
down
take
some
notes
notes.
over here. Can I say
Well,
one more thing before
Don't
we
know about
close?
that.
I got to give this one quote. I wrote it down. I was going to save it for our after discussion, but I have to tell you, I have said this now to several people. I think Noah said it. Success equals humility plus curiosity plus effort. And I think that, and Kristen and I've been, this has been a hot topic with Kristen and I lately, this humility aspect in there. It's key. Did you create that?
Yeah, that one is mine. Several of the Noah mantras are stolen from the detective mentor I had, who's still a good friend. His name is Don Johnson. Great name for a private investigator, right? But that one is actually sort of my own framework for writing, but I think, not to be too grandiose, I think I can apply it out beyond writing too. It's and that's sort of the challenge, I think, for all of us is, or for me certainly. It's okay, the effort, everybody can put in the effort. I think the humility and curiosity are really crucial ingredients there. And so there's a quote on my wall from Einstein. He has the phrase, have holy curiosity. And I love that. The idea that you should view curiosity as something sacred. It's that's special. The opportunity to say, I don't know everything, and I can ask questions, I can learn, I can, push in different directions or consider something from a different viewpoint.
Yeah,
excellent.
I love it.
Well, as we expected, this has been a fascinating discussion, and we have definitely gone deep on some subjects. But before we let you go, Scott, we want to know what's on your radar. Can you share a little bit about what you've got going next?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm working on another book under the SCOTT CARSON name right now, which means it will have some, level of the weirdness to it, I guess. If not a ghost, there's always something a little bit different. And this one moves between the present day in Maine and the Cold War era in Indiana. And it opens with a bunch of pilots getting phone calls from their mothers telling them not to fly. Under no circumstances can they fly. And one of the really disturbing elements to some of our pilots is that the calls are coming from their mothers, but their mothers are dead. And so that's my opening hook.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds intriguing. Oh my goodness. Well, I know our listeners are going to want to connect with you either as Scott Carson or as Michael Koryta. And I want to tell them how. You have a website and it's under Michael Koryta. I'm going to spell that for our listeners. It's Michael, KORYTA.com. And you have a whole separate section for your Scott Carson writing. So I'm sure that people will enjoy that. And they can also find you all over social media. You've got a Facebook site, an X. You're on Goodreads, on Instagram, on BookBub. And I am so grateful, and Chris is so grateful that you've come on our show to discuss this new book, Lost Man's Lane. It is wonderful. And we hope you come back to talk about your future ones.
Oh, anytime. Thank you. This is, you have no idea how special it is to do this kind of talk with people who actually read the book and cared and thought about it deeply. So I can't thank you enough.
Thank you for writing it. Thanks for coming on. There's a little picture again. Lost Man's Lane, Scott Carson.
Take care, Scott. Thank you again.
Thank you.
It's always fantastic having Michael Koryta, aka Scott Carson, and Kristen. We love this book so much. There's so many things to talk about. I can't even believe it. Let's go back to this seen, unseen world. I just love that about the Scott Carson writing, because it is something that we all think about every single day. And to what extent, I would have a hard time believing if someone told me they did not believe in any kind of unseen world whatsoever. But I know that there are people who believe that. I just feel like in our very deepest, innermost being, we sense something more. How do you feel?
I absolutely agree. And, I think that's especially true now because there's palpable evil in the world. We look around and we see people acting in ways we just never, ever expected that people would act and harming others. And so I think when you have that heightened level of angst about what's going on in the world, it forces you to really evaluate, well, what is the purpose of us being here? Is somebody in control? And, people who have a strong faith in God, I know I do, for me, that's something that I'm I know that there is a spiritual world and things at play out there that I can't necessarily explain or understand. But you've got to come to those conclusions on your own and explore things and have that curiosity, like Scott was talking about. What do you think?
I love your answer. And this is what we have in common. That we both are believers in the unseen world and God believers. And I like how you brought out the evil. I don't think you can believe in ultimate good unless you believe in ultimate evil. There just is two absolute opposite sides. We see it in everything, even in our own selves, in internal
Yeah.
battlement sometimes between doing the right thing and the wrong thing, making the wise choice and the selfish choice. But
Yeah.
it's interesting. That's so true.
Yeah.
And
Well,
let's
that's
talk a little bit more about what he said about this open mind, this curiosity. What did you think about that?
Oh, I thought that was great because, we don't want to open ourselves up to being swayed by, the new Y2K or whatever the new conspiracy theory is. But being curious means that you ask the right questions and you are open to the answers. And I think that's the key to curiosity is not dismissing anything out of hand, but looking for things upon which you can rely, things that have all those indicators of reliability. And so I love that he said that. I don't know. Do you look at that a little differently or?
Same as you. And we base this podcast that we're going to open these books and we're going to talk about some hot button topics.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about heartfelt themes. We're going to talk about things that people don't sometimes want to talk about.
Yeah.
Because if you close your mind to curiosity, I'm not saying that you have to accept all of these different ideas, but we have to be willing to listen. We have to be open to each other and listen to each other, truly listen. And so I agree with you. I love that. Success equals humility plus curiosity plus effort. And humility, I think, is huge too. Like, I feel like that plays in a strong way. Do you?
Absolutely. I mean, without humility, how do you know when you are wrong? Right? Because you got to be willing to entertain the thought that you're wrong about something. So I like that. And I also loved, by the way, you asked him about the symbolism of a serpent and a snake, because we saw that throughout this book. But we also see that in our own lives, it has those dual symbols of healing. I mean, look at the medical symbol for the physicians and medical practice. And even in the Old Testament, a snake on a pole was how people were healed. But we also see where that snake represents something fearsome and, scary and maybe dark. So he was definitely playing with all of these themes in this story, which is why I think we enjoyed it so much because the writing is effortless, but the themes that he explores are ones that I know we're all intrigued by.
I agree. I loved it. I'm going to hold it up one more time for our listeners. Lost Man's Lane by Scott Carson. This is a book you definitely want to read. It's got a lot of great topics in there and it's fun. It's a lot of fun too.
It sure is. And listeners, I want to tell you about who we have coming up next on Bookstorm Podcast. We've got Kate Quinn and Janie Chang coming on together, Mary Kubica, Christopher Reich, Amiko Jean, Bonnie Jo Campbell, J.D. Barker, Dervla McTiernan, Kate White, Lisa Wingate, B.A. Paris, Hank Philippi Ryan, Ramona Ossobel, and Jill Shelvis. And we want you to stay with us on our radar. Go to bookstormpodcast.com. You can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube. Just search for Bookstorm and Podcast and we should come up. And remember, listeners, until the next time, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.